Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching The Naturalist Capitalist. I am your host, Reed Coverdale, and I'm lucky to have Hannah Cox on the other end today. How's it going today, Hannah?
Good to be here, Reed.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, just for those who don't know who you are? I found you through Twitter, and then I found your YouTube channel. But just give us the lowdown on what it is you do and what message you're trying to get out there.
Yeah, so I'm kind of similar to you in the fact that I didn't start off in a political background. I sort of got into this work in a roundabout way, but I began my career in the music industry in Nashville, and I just absolutely hated it. And so I started working on the side for a Second Amendment group a number of years ago. I just really love the Second Amendment. I thought, I like politics. Why not, try my hand at this? And I ended up really falling in love with it, but also just recognizing like how much worse off we were than I even recognized, how far down this line away from, the ideals I was brought up to believe in, free markets and limited government, individual liberty, we actually were. And so I became really passionate about politics, but more so about these ideas and finding ways to elevate them in the culture and in society. And so I have been sort of slowly progressing out of music into politics for about 2 or 3 years. I did a lot of work with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I did some work with different campaigns. I started writing a lot. And then in 2016, I moved full-time into political work, starting off with a free market think tank in Tennessee called the Beacon Center. And we did both pro bono, public interest economic litigation. So we would actually sue the government on behalf of people who'd been violated by it. And also work to move legislation. So I got to do that in a number of different areas, from school choice to healthcare to taxes to corporate welfare and criminal justice reform, and just kind of all over the place. It was really a great first introductory full-time role. But after a few years there, I was hired as a senior national manager of an organization called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. So I've been doing that work for the past 3 years, working to dismantle the death penalty in the country, but also working to really educate people about the nature of violence and about the opportunity costs that the death penalty presents, and all of the money that we could be better directing towards programs that it would actually increase public safety and make our communities better. And then recently I've added a fellowship with the Foundation for Economic Education. So I've been doing a lot of writing and commentary and video work there. I also write for Newsmax and for the Washington Examiner. And so I'm pretty active on all social media platforms. And 6 months ago, I launched my own show called Based. So people can find that on YouTube and Spotify and iTunes and Facebook. And so I've been very busy lately, but I spend most of my time working to push back on the government, working to fight for people's individual liberty, and really working to try to move our country back towards its foundations.
Well, those are all very great things. And what I really like about you is you're not afraid to really push back against the negative connotations that are crafted toward capitalism or small government. You really attack things like corporate welfare, and you just mentioned the death penalty, things that a lot of conservatives are kind of weak on. You really attack them and really say, this is not part of our message. This is not free markets. This isn't small, limited government. But we'll get into those issues. But I wanted to talk about the interesting fact that we have a very similar upbringing. I heard your podcast with Clint on his show, Liberty Lockdown, and everyone should go subscribe to Clint if you haven't already. But I was shocked to hear like you were homeschooled. I was also until high school. You were brought up in a very Christian, religious family. You were a big supporter of John McCain. That's all right out of my book. I'm a little bit younger than you. I think I'm 6 years younger than you, but I was, in high school, I was a big fan of John McCain. And it's just kind of funny. I have changed a lot of my views since then, but at the same time, the ones that are similar still to that time, I think in the present moment, I didn't realize that John McCain was not really about small government, and he wasn't really about the Constitution. I just thought he was back then. Now I realize he isn't. But has that happened for you too? I mean, I'm assuming you've gone through changes, but were you unaware of the fact that he wasn't, the Republican Party wasn't really standing for everything that it said it stood for?
Yeah, I had a very similar, what I would call deconstructive process, where I had to actually go in and examine what I believed and why, and figure out, what it was grounded in. And I think that that's something I hope everybody gets the opportunity to do, both with their faith and in their politics. I think so often we're just handed down our views and our beliefs, and we don't really critically think about them. We don't really evaluate them to see if they're consistent. And that was sort of where I stood by the time I graduated college. I didn't go to school for political science. This wasn't something I thought about day in, day out. I was sort of I was an average American. I was somebody who maybe watched a couple debates, and I voted in national elections, and that was about it. But I had been brought up to believe in things like free markets and limited government and individual liberty. And as a person who was brought up in a Republican, conservative Christian household, I was just sort of trained to think that all Republicans thought that way. Like I distinctly remember, not only did I love John McCain in 2008 and maybe wear a John McCain mask to a Halloween party. That's the dirt in my closet. But I also remember in 2012, when, the real Ron Paul movement was happening, being so outraged at people who wouldn't let it go when he didn't win the nomination. I was like, guys, we have to defeat Obama. Don't you understand? Who cares what Republican we put up? We just have to beat Obama. It was very much in that way of thinking about things. And it was when I was working for the Second Amendment group in Tennessee. I was going around, I was actually speaking to Tea Party groups. I was sort of, getting my hands dirty for the first time in politics. And this was in 2012, 2013. I was encountering a lot of Republicans and conservatives who were espousing things I did not agree with, and that had never been presented as this was something Republicans believed. I was encountering a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment, a lot of anti-immigration sentiment, a lot of the things that really grew into the populism Trump movement that we saw take hold in 2016. And I wasn't really surprised by that, because I had seen the origins of it had already been moving at the grassroots in these southern states for quite some time. And I just remember when I was encountering some of that thinking, well, that's not what I think. That's not what I agree. That's not limited government. That's not free market. And it really forced me to go and examine what I believed and why, and get a better foundation and set of principles. I started studying economics. So I'm very much self-taught in everything that I've really started to teach and write about. And that was a great experience for me. It was hard because, so much of our identity is wrapped up in these team mentalities that we have in this country. But it's also very freeing to be able to break out of that and say, I'm going to make my opinion based off of the facts. I'm going to find a consistent ideology. I'm going to apply it, and I'm going to apply it free from any party or group. And I'm going to really be an independent, critical thinker. And that's something that I think has long-term been very beneficial for me. I don't end up making many of the mistakes that many of my counterparts make, where they kind of go along and they're pulled by the tide of whatever political party they're in, and they end up standing for really terrible things or really bad ideas. I think contrary to that, libertarian ideas, they're not always popular. They're not always the ones that get the most prominence, but they do usually end up being proved right down the road. And so that was something I needed to go through. I'm glad that I had that experience. And then a little bit later, I sort of had the same process with my faith, where, in 2016, I saw so many evangelicals that not only went for Trump, but that were his core base. And he was espousing so many things and values that were just totally antithetical to everything that I believe in, based on my faith, and based on, the way that we should treat people, based on how we should value people, how we should speak towards people. And I was so distraught at that. It made me really angry. It made me very embarrassed. I, talked to my dad, who is a Southern Baptist minister. I was like, I think I'm going to convert to Catholicism. I was just so outraged and upset.
That's worse than becoming an atheist if you go to Catholicism.
Right. I'm going to be a Catholic.
Yeah.
I love the Catholics. I work with a lot of Catholics, and I just, in the past 4 years, I've seen them show up and live out their values in a more consistent way than I did my own denomination. So that was also equally hard. I think almost harder than losing your political faith is losing your actual faith to an extent. But again, it pushed me into figuring out what my actual relationship, what it was, what I actually believed apart from the institution of religion, and learning to stand on my own in that. And I think that when you have these kind of deconstruction experiences, it makes you so much stronger in your actual arguments, because it's no longer tied to anything else other than what your core intrinsic values are as a person. And when you figured those things out, it doesn't really matter if you're in the majority. It doesn't matter if people push back on you or bully you. You're acting based on your own morals. And that's a very powerful thing to walk in.
Yeah, that's actually scary how similar that is to my story, because I was attracted to Ron Paul in my senior year of high school. And it was mostly because he was a real conservative. Like, he really wanted to cut welfare spending. I wasn't really listening to the stuff about the wars or the Patriot Act. It was mostly just, wow, he actually means it. He's got a history of voting against more spending than all these other guys do. And then when he lost, I voted for Romney because we had to beat Obama. And then it was like 2013, 2014, I started listening to different people and really deconstructing my conservative worldview and also my Christian worldview. And what I did is in 2015, I actually took off and I traveled to all 50 states. It took like 2 years, and worked in Colorado and Arizona. When I was in Colorado, I worked with a bunch of Mexican immigrants roofing industrial buildings in Denver. And what I realized was it really struck me when I first went to California, because I had this preconceived image of what California was. It was beaches and liberals. That's what it is. And then you go there and you're in the redwoods, and you're in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and you're in the deserts and forests and, beautiful lakes and all this stuff that you're not expecting. And you realize, okay, maybe I had a false image of what this was, and I was just projecting it without actually trying to find out what it really was. So then I started thinking, what else in my life am I doing that with other than just these states that I haven't been to? So I really started opening my mind to other things, and it ended up leading me away from faith personally. But politically, it really brought me to libertarianism, because I tried swinging left a little bit at first just to taste it. And I was like, okay, this isn't me. That's definitely not who I am. And I kind of came back almost to the middle and realized libertarianism really made sense to me. And it was a new way of thinking in general. I had, up to that point in my life, I had a goal that I wanted to reach through research or through opinions. I knew where I wanted to end up. I want to end up being conservative at the end of the day. So I'm going to sift through this information and have it align with my desired goal, instead of taking everything you read at face value and letting it influence your final decision. And it was just a complete transformation I went through, and it brought me to libertarianism. But it was just funny hearing you describe that, because it's so similar.
Well, and I love so much that you did that, because what you were doing was really breaking out of your bubble. And I often talk about, I'm very into psychology, I'm very into sociology. And one thing I've noted for so many years is that in America, we are still so divided. We just do not encounter people who are different than us. I remember one time an ex-boyfriend of mine wanted to take an overseas trip, and he said, "Do you have a passport?" And I was like, "Yeah, everybody has a passport." He was like, "No, like 30% of people have a passport, but everybody in my world has a passport," right? We're so unlikely to know people outside of our ethnicity, outside of our religion, outside of our socioeconomic bubble, outside of even just, our like sort of cult cliquish kind of places we go and things we like to do. Like we're so surrounded by people who are like us. And I think that that's highly problematic. I think it makes it very easy to stereotype people, to be afraid of people, to believe the worst intentions of people. And so I've worked for years to break out of that, but I've also been very fortunate to have opportunities that allowed me to. When I first started working in music, I worked for a Black gospel label, and so I was working in an environment where I was actually the minority at the office, and that was an amazing experience and was very influential on me. After I graduated, I went to a church that was very focused on multinational nationalities and multi-ethnic backgrounds, and trying to really bring people together, and that was another awesome opportunity. And now in my work, for the past 4 or 5, almost 6 years now, full time, I've gotten to work in a number of fields on a number of issues where I am consistently working with people on both the left and right and center of the political aisle. And so I've really gotten to know people who believe and think differently than me. And it's been so wonderful, because what I've learned is that, I don't have as I don't have as much difference with people on the left or right as it would feel like if I just sat back and watched TV. And I don't have bad relationships with those people. I tend to get along very well with all of them and genuinely like and respect them. And I find that, when we do sit down and have these conversations, we actually can come to a agreement much easier than you might imagine. And so I think, you're taking off and going and seeing different parts of the country and living in different places and working alongside people in different places. Like, what an amazing opportunity to break out of your bubble. And I think that would naturally have sort of a deconstruction impact on somebody, just getting to experience that and see people and really recognize how similar we actually are at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I tell people that a lot, that I don't want everybody to arrive at the same conclusion that I do, or want everyone to think the same way I do, because that would be boring. I just want people to be honest about how they arrive at their conclusions. And if those conclusions are completely different than mine, cool. But I just want people to actually think their way through things, because I know from personal experience that that's not what I used to do. And I can see how detrimental it was on my train of thought. And so, I mean, if everybody actually tried to understand their neighbors or their, their countrymen, and actually listen to them and actually walk in their shoes for a mile, I think we'd live in a much better place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So something I want to touch on, I certainly don't want to get into a debate about religion, because that would be a whole different video. But as I was moving away from my faith, it was simultaneous with the Trump takeover of the Christian right, at least the end phase. Like, I've been kind of moving away from my faith for a couple of years, but the nail in the coffin was around the same time as the Trump era. And to me, it just proved that so many people were not, they weren't really true in their convictions, because to get behind that, and not that like anything in the past was better, not that George W. Bush or John McCain were really any better, but how enthralled the Christian right was with Donald Trump and with his ugly collectivism towards certain groups of people, and how divisive he was and how hateful he was. It really rubbed me the wrong way to see people that, even though if I weren't still religious, I still respected a lot and still thought a lot of, and not just people I know, but, people like Franklin Graham, seeing them just like go full force behind Trump, that really rubbed me the wrong way. How do you process that? What do you think that was all about?
Yeah, it's been hard. I don't want to give the impression that I didn't have any struggles with my faith before 2016. I did. I'm a pastor's kid, so I have religious trauma. That's what I call it. But I do think I'd sort of been going along to get along for some time until that hit the fan. And watching not only the cult-like worship of Trump that came over the evangelical right, but also watching how that body treated the people who pushed back against it, even people that they had held in great prominence. They basically ran Beth Moore out of Southern Baptist world recently because she was offended that Trump bragged about assaulting women. Russell Moore, who I think is a tremendous leader in the Southern Baptist world, he's the head of the Ethics and Religious Commission, and I have great respect for Dr. Moore. He's had his job under threat multiple times because he has biblically pushed back on Trump. That's not just grassroots pushing back on him. That's other leaders within the Southern Baptist world who have threatened his employment because of that. It's been really hard as a whole, but there's a deacon in my dad's church that always says tall timber will stand out from the brush. And I do think we've seen that, right? We've seen people like Dr. Moore and Beth Moore and David French, who's also been attacked very, very horribly by many on the right, who have stood fast in their convictions. And I think we've identified the people whose beliefs are really grounded in theology and a real understanding of faith and the doctrine that Jesus taught, versus those who were just really part of a institution in this country, an institution that I think, especially since the late 70s, early 80s, has increasingly become intertwined with the Republican Party, to the extent that the average person in this country who's a part of the evangelical right, I don't think can any longer tell the difference between the two. I really don't. And I think that that's sad. I think that's a failure of our preachers, of our leaders. I was not surprised to see people people like Franklin Graham go the way they did. I think there's always been grifters. There's always been people within religious institutions who are most concerned with their own prominence and their own position to power. And that was certainly illustrated. So it's been disappointing, but I also think, it also has been encouraging in some ways to see those who've stood out from the rest of the crowd and really risen above it. And again, it provided me an opportunity to really begin to question my faith and what I actually believed apart from the church. And I read a lot of Rachel Held Evans over the past 2 years, and I really appreciated her books and her question. She was kind of what I call a questioning Christian, which is, I guess, where I would put myself, where she has faith, but she has so many questions about what she's been taught in the institution itself. And just a lot of questions about how we got the doctrines that we have. And so I just appreciated some of that. Where I ended up was at a place where I recognized that had I been brought up in another family or another part of the world, I very likely could be any number of other religions. And the fact that I have been brought up in this one means it's what I know best. I believe Jesus, did come to earth and die for our sins. And I do believe his teachings are how we should conduct ourselves. I think they are the greatest message ever taught. If you can separate that from the way the Christian church behaves and really just focus on those teachings of how we are to treat others, of how we are to conduct ourselves. I don't know of any better law or code of ethics to abide by. And so I choose to continue that. I do believe there's a God that answers prayers. And so I have my personal relationship, but I've been able to separate that largely from a denomination. And that's been very empowering and freeing. And I actually think it's given me more faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I have the utmost respect for those of you who have remained steadfast. I'd throw my parents in that category, and I have several close friends who did not go along with the Trump hysteria. And, the thing that's hard about Trump is he is framed for so much stupid crap that he doesn't deserve to be framed for. But a lot of people see the attacks on him, and in turn, they defend him for everything, when there is a lot that was really bad about him. Whether it was the morality stuff we're talking about now, or if it was the wars or the spending or the spying. It's just really weird how it's kind of like with Obama. I remember Obama, a lot of people were criticizing him because he wasn't dropping enough bombs and he wasn't hard enough on the Middle East, and he wasn't doing, he was an open borders president, they would say, all this stuff. And then you start actually looking into it and you realize, like, what? All these criticisms are BS. But then you do realize, but he actually is really bad. There's a lot of stuff that Obama is doing that's really, really bad. I've seen that with both of them, that some people look past the media narrative and they find out that most of the media narrative is bullshit. And then they stop digging right there. So then they think like, this guy's an angel because everything these guys are saying about him is bad. And it's like, well, you didn't dig quite deep enough. Like, you got to get past the facade of bullshit that the media is putting up there. And then you dig in and you see like the actual evil stuff that these guys are really doing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because it's easy to sort of get defensive because the media does attack people for the dumbest things, and it often is exaggerated and it often is highly hypocritical, right? Like they'll totally change the framing. We've even seen it with immigration camps at the border that still exist and are just as bad now as they were last year under Trump. But now the words used to describe them are very different. They're trying to limit the number of pictures coming out around them. And so when you see that kind of hypocrisy, I think it's easy to sort of get defensive and to kind of get into your team mentality. And the real problem is that the media very rarely covers the actual atrocities committed by presidents. And we know there are numerous of those under every president we've had in my lifetime. But because of that, it's hard for the average person. I hear a lot of people get attacked for not being more participatory or for being so easily misled in their system. But the reality is the average person is working, like you said, 60 hours a week. They're doing their jobs, they're going about their days, Right. They have kids. they're busy. They have, financial strains, they have familial strains, they might have their own personal mental health issues or addiction issues, or who knows what all they're struggling with. They're not sitting here on Twitter keeping up with the day to day, or really, tracking the different policies that are moving and different statements being made. It's a lot to keep up with. I often used to say, especially when I was working, at one state legislature consistently when I was in Tennessee, even when I was just at one, it was so hard to keep up with the moving of the bills that we were moving, because there'd be backroom deals and all of a sudden somebody would have moved on this. And if you were somebody trying to keep up with that outside of being at the legislature day in and day out, there was no way, much less if you were trying to track it in multiple legislatures across the country. It's just so much. And that's why we need a really good media to keep people informed and to hold elected leaders accountable. But we don't have that. We haven't had it. And I actually think there are real detrimental effects to that besides just, fake news or bias. I think the worst situation is that the people don't have the information we need to actually participate in our republic as we were designed to, because the media is failing to do their jobs. And that's an ever increasing problem that we have.
Yeah, that's why we're stepping up. And that's why, even though I'm working 60 hours a week, I'm doing this because the media isn't doing it right. So we gotta
Right.
fill a gap where they're not doing their job. But I wanted to get into your YouTube channel because it's great. Everyone should go check it out. I do have a link in the description. Based with Hannah Cox. It's very good. I've watched several of your videos, but your most recent upload was about capitalism. And I think it's titled, I Don't Think You Know What Capitalism Is. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very good. And it actually kind of outlines why I started this show, because I started this show last May. And, we had just had the CARES Act and all these giant corporate bailouts while everyone's locked in their houses. And I saw Bernie Sanders tweeting how this was unfettered capitalism. I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, how is this capitalist at all? So I started the show and, I started talking a lot about capitalism, what actual capitalism is. But why did you start the show? Did you see a similar problem that people just that seems to be what you talk about most, and you refer to yourself as a rabid capitalist. So did you just have to get the word out there because there's so much ignorance? Was it kind of the same impetus behind it?
Yeah. I love capitalism, and I really didn't know until a few years ago that most people didn't. It shocked me to see Bernie Sanders have the support that he did in 2016. It shocked me that to many people, socialism is not as dirty of a word as Nazism or fascism.
Right.
Socialism and communism have contributed to a vast number of deaths and destruction worldwide. And it is troubling to me that so few people seem to know that. But I started the show not just around capitalism, but I wanted to have a broad discussion where we could really break down multiple issues on the show and get to the root cause of problems, really talk about the root theory of different issues that we discuss in society. Because, again, as somebody who's gotten to work around people on both the left and the right and libertarian circles, what I find is that there's a lot of disorganized thinking and misinformation around our language. We often can't get to common solutions because we don't have the right language to even agree on the common problem. And if you really sit there and talk with people, you'll often find that you do agree on the problem and you're just coming up with very different solutions, often because people misunderstand that underlying cause of it. And so I think that the point of BASED is to try to establish that conversation zone for people. And capitalism, the episode that I just produced that came out this week, was a topic I had wanted to cover all along. It's my sixth one. 6 is my favorite number. So I timed that to correlate with this episode because it's just very special to me. And I do think as a whole, people have no clue what the word capitalism means. They really, even people who say they support it have no clue what capitalism is. And that's why when they pass things like the pork stimulus bills, they don't even notice that this is actually an attack on capitalism. So I wanted to have an episode where we could first and foremost just get a very fundamental understanding of what free market capitalism actually is, by what metrics it is set. And then I wanted to examine our country and whether or not it's a capitalist country, whether or not it was designed to be, whether or not it still is. And then I wanted to look a bit more intensely at what the effects of capitalism have been globally when tried. And so that was sort of where we went with the show, and it's been getting very good feedback, which is exciting. But I hope that it approaches this in a way that doesn't shut people on the left off, because I genuinely think that many people have been led to believe they have a problem with capitalism, when in reality, the problems they actually have are cronyism. But because they believe that America is a capitalist system, they see these really bad things happening at the hands of our government, and they think that's capitalism. When in reality, I'm with them on a lot of the things that they're mad about. I'm super pissed off about corporate welfare. I'm mad about bailouts. I'm mad about regulations and tariffs. There's a lot of things that I actually think we agree upon. We're just using different words for them. So I'm hoping that we get there. I had another episode, my first episode that I did was called Democratic Socialism is Just Socialism. And it similarly kind of dug into the Norwegian countries that people often hold up as examples of democratic socialism, and really examine the ways in which they are actually more capitalist than we are. And so I try to do that with each of my shows and help people just sort of get a better grip on things. And then if we still disagree, we still disagree. But at least at that point, we're using a common language to disagree with, and we'll probably get further.
Yeah, I mean, I've had that same the same situation exactly, where I'm talking to a socialist, and they're screaming about how horrible capitalism is, and they're saying we should have just let the banks fail. And I'm like, yes, you're correct. That's capitalism.
Yes,
we want
I would love that.
But we're just getting into some dumb battle over semantics. And it's not just with capitalism, it's with so many things. I mean, I've just seen the devaluation of words over the last, it seems like the last decade. I mean, words just don't mean anything anymore. I don't like telling people I'm a libertarian or I'm an atheist, unless that's how I have to sum it up quickly, because then they instantly have all these preconceived ideas about what I am, when they might be completely inaccurate, just because their only interaction with either of those labels has just been negative. And so then they instantly take the most negative part of whatever that label is and apply it to me. And it's just really unproductive. And I started the show similarly to the reason you did, just to try to get people to talk about these issues. I've had people from the left come on here, like I've had Nico House and Kim Iverson, and I've given invitations to other people who haven't come on, but I just want to talk about these ideas and really get people to think about what it is they believe. It goes back to what I was talking about earlier. I don't care if you agree with me. I just want you to actually know why you believe what you believe, and then we can have an honest discussion. But I'm really glad that you're out there defending the good name of capitalism. And it's interesting. Republicans are like our biggest enemy almost, because they claim to support the same thing that we do, but they really don't. They have like this extremely tainted version of capitalism that's really indistinguishable from what the Democrats are pushing all the time. And they're extremely protectionist now too. That's been an interesting evolution to see over the last 5 or 6 years. And you can't find anyone who supports free trade anymore. Those are dirty words at this point. But you can speak to these issues more eloquently than I can. Why is free trade a good idea, and why have tariffs and trade wars not been healthy for the middle class in America?
Yeah, it's been very weird to watch that progression. Again, I'd sort of had woken up to the fact that Republicans were not as free market as they claimed to be prior to 2016. But then when 2016 hit, they just went full on nationalists, which, nationalism is every bit as bad as socialism. It's really just kind of a different form, honestly. But as a whole, they've moved very quickly. And I think that, again, goes back to the fact that most people have no clue what they believe or why. They just follow the party wherever they go, and they end up being led off a cliff because they don't actually know where they're going. That's been true with trade. It's been very weird to watch the progression where all of a sudden Republicans think free trade is bad. They want all kinds of protectionism. They want tariffs. Tariffs are just another form of tax. This goes all the way back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. It's one of the very basic metrics for a capitalist system is the free trade of goods. It is every bit as bad to tell me that I can't sell something for the best price I can get to somebody in China as it is to tell me that I can't sell something to somebody in America for the best price I should get. Free market capitalism means that I can sell my good for the best price I can get wherever I can get it. And vice versa. I can buy a product for the best price I can get it from wherever I can get it, no matter what. As a whole, free trade is something that brings down the cost of goods. It's something that improves productivity. In my episode, I talked about the short story by Leonard E. Reed, who's the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, where I'm a fellow. And he has this great essay everybody, I think, should read called I Pencil. And in it, he talks about essentially the division of labor and how we need within society to have people who can do individual tasks come together to produce more goods. One individual person could not possibly produce a number 2 pencil on their own. And when you think about it, it actually is very true and fantastic. You would have to have, the ropes and the trucks to pull down the tree, and then the ability to cut the tree, and then be able to shave it, and then to build the rubber. It goes on and on and on. But just as you need that division of labor within a country to increase the number of goods available to people and bring down the cost of those goods, you also need it internationally. You need that kind of cooperation across different countries. It is more effective for some countries to produce some goods than others. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having a trade deficit. In the show, I jokingly said, I have a trade deficit with Louis Vuitton, and I'm very happy with that. And I would like to increase that trade deficit. But that's something everybody could find a very simple example for in their life. You probably have a trade deficit with your local grocery store. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not economically harmful in any way. Placing tariffs on those goods and services and sales is harmful to people. We saw that from Trump's tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs that they instigated alone in 2019, I think it was like $57 billion in annual consumer prices that we paid. It's extremely expensive. Tariffs merely get passed on to the consumers. Companies just tack that on to the cost of goods. And so really the only person it hurts is the taxpayers. It's just not something that makes any sense. And it was weird to watch, Trump say, we will never be a socialist nation, while passing this kind of really asinine public policy that moved in that direction and moved away from free market capitalism, and his base just didn't seem economically astute enough to even notice it. So that's frustrating because again, we're not finding common language. And I agree with you that when you have people running around saying they're capitalists and then behaving in such a manner, it hurts the very good name of capitalism that has achieved more for mankind than any other system. And it instead gets blamed for all of these big government intrusions into the market, which are actually a direct assault on it. So that's why I get really mad about tariffs, but I also get really mad about corporate welfare and bailouts and all of these other crony practices that are anything but capitalism, and yet capitalism gets blamed for them. And that's the ever-growing problem in our society. And I think that is why you've seen such an interest in socialism and other systems recently. So I actually do blame people on the right who claim to support capitalism while pushing things that are not, for the decreasing popularity of this word.
Yeah, it's funny because the 2 stimulus bills that Trump signed into law, I think the CARES Act was 2.7 trillion, and then the stimulus bill right before Christmas was 2.4 trillion. And then Biden signs a 1.9 trillion dollar bill, and it also has the biggest checks going out to people. The CARES Act was $1,200, I think, and then the one before Christmas was $600, and then the one that Biden signed, I think it was $1,400, and it was 1.9 trillion. So the Republicans are suddenly screaming about fiscal responsibility again and how much waste is in the bill, when it's the smallest out of the 3, and it has the largest percentage that's actually going directly to people. And so when you take that stance and then you try to defend capitalism, of course, the innocent bystander who doesn't really know economic theory is going to say, well, capitalism doesn't sound very good to me. This bill was the best one for us.
Right. Yeah, there's all kinds of problems with those bills. I think my colleague Brad Palumbo did a piece recently talking about ultimately they spent something like $41,000 per taxpayer in corporate welfare, essentially. We got chump change compared to that. Even if you got all the stimuluses, you got, a little over $2,000. And yet you basically spent thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars that went to large corporations, went to corporate welfare, went to cronyism. It's just really unjust. It's something that we're certainly going to pay for. I think Americans might like getting that little bump in their bank accounts, over the past year, but that little bump is going to cost us dearly over the coming decades as our national debt balloons, as inflation increases. This is going to be severely problematic. It's going to hurt our employment. It's going to hurt our real wages. resources, it's going to have all kinds of detrimental impacts. And again, when people don't really understand, economic systems, they don't have the basic economic literacy, they can't understand how that will eventually impact other things that will harm them. So when the harm does come about, they again blame, these buzzwords they're given because they just simply don't understand what's happened economically to create these systems and these circumstances.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, the sickest I've ever felt was when we passed that bill with almost a unanimous vote right before Christmas. They gave everyone like 4 hours to read it. It was 5,500 pages long. 2 Democrats and 56 Republicans, and then Justin Amash were the only people to vote against it. And, the headlines from the news were, oh, you might have your $600 in time for Christmas. There wasn't anything about all the pork that was in that thing. And what was especially heinous about that one to me, with the CARES Act, I can at least understand why it was rushed through, and because we didn't know what was happening. People were freaking out. There was this new disease no one knew about. So I was totally against it, but I could at least understand why it passed, I guess. But that one, I mean, a lot of people have been locked down in their houses. They've lost their jobs. $600 doesn't get you anywhere. And I mean, that bill was it was terrible. I mean, it was the smallest checks going to people. There were billions of dollars going overseas to Egypt and Sudan and Israel, just all these countries that have nothing to do with us, nothing to do with the coronavirus. And it was just so propagandized that this was great and this is what we needed to do right now. And then when Trump actually looked like he was going to go against it for a second, I mean, he was catching all sorts of flack from everybody. And I was cheering him on, which is like the only time other than when he met with Kim Jong-un, that I've like really cheered him on in his entire presidency. But I just felt so hopeless in that moment because I had a bit of an audience at that point. I had like 2,000 subscribers. And I was just telling them, I was like, guys, this is why I made this show. And not enough people are waking up. Like, this should literally be causing a revolutionary war right now that this is happening. But no one cared. No one knew what was in the bill. How did you feel when that went through?
Yeah, I think I've had that sort of feeling for years now. So it's not, I'm getting a bit jaded. Yeah, getting a little like cynical and jaded. I'm not surprised. I so appreciate Justin Amash. I'm devastated he's not in Congress anymore. He's been so instrumental in my own development. And he's been one of the few leaders who's not only consistent, but who is informative to the American public about what's happening up there. I don't think people recognize how little power even the average congressperson or senator holds when it comes to legislation. They are told how to vote by their parties. If they don't, they're going to primary them. They're going to fundraise against them. They're going to kick them off their committeeships. They're going to basically make it, irrelevant for them to be there. And so the vast majority of them fall in line. They're told how to vote. They very rarely get the bills in time to read them. They very rarely know what they're voting on. It's really, our system is so utterly broken where you really just have a few key decision makers, mostly the leadership within Congress. And so they're going to keep shoving this through. And really, I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of issues I care about, but I have to be quite frank and say that ultimately nothing really will turn the tide back in our favor unless we fix the money in politics. It really comes down to that. Yeah. Term limits won't fix it. There's no hope unless we really get control of the money, because the money controls these politicians, and it outweighs any of our voices or votes. I used to say, contact your congressman, but they don't care. They don't care. They care what their donors say. They care what their PACs say. They care what these few small connected industry insiders say. We really have this very crony system these days. And so I think that's what people have got to maybe start coalescing around, is figuring out how to defund these guys and to limit the amount of money in politics, and to really bring us back to having representative government. Because right now, I know most of my leaders don't represent me. They represent people who have a lot more money than me. And so we're going to keep seeing this kind of thing. The stimulus bills, I wrote at the very beginning of the pandemic, a crisis is the perfect time to seize power, and essentially just said, here's what's going to happen. And sure enough, it did. They're going to take away your rights. They're going to find new powers for government. They're not going to scale those back once the crisis is over. We're living with the Patriot Act 20 years later. We're going to be living with some of these other things that they're doing many, many many years later, I'm sure. And so, you can try to fight it, but the inertia is not on our side. And so that's not the most optimistic message to give people, but I actually, in some ways, think it is what we should be saying. I think we need to have a more aggressive standpoint and really recognize the level of threat that we face. And hopefully that will start to instigate more people becoming active and really coming together. Because right now, there's a lot of what I call everyday heroes. There's people like you hosting informative shows. There's people who are trying to educate people and they're showing up to lobby, but it's kind of a drop in the bucket because the vast majority of people simply just don't have the time, aren't paying attention, aren't informed enough to really participate in a meaningful way. So I think that's where we've got to get people is really start waking them up to the threat that they face and giving them more concrete ways to become involved in pushing back.
Yeah, I mean, I really think if people knew what was in that bill, that something would have happened. What happened on January 6th would have happened on December 20th instead. People would have been like, are you kidding me? No, we're not taking this. And actually, the few Trump supporter friends that I have that I was able to get that information to, after Trump changed his mind and decided to sign the bill, that was the first time that I saw them really turn on him. They were like, wow, you don't represent us. You don't stand for us. So it is possible. We just got to get that information out there to people, but it's so hard. Yeah, I mean, I really like what you said about getting money out of politics. And to me, where progressives fall short on that is they don't realize you have to get politics out of money to get money out of politics. As long as politicians have so much control over the economy and so much control over winners and losers, then you can pass whatever campaign finance reform legislation you want. They're still going to figure out how to get money to the people that they want to, behind closed doors. So, I mean, would you agree? We have to it's a two-way street, right?
Yeah, it's like I said, I used to work in the music industry. It's like payola. If you're familiar with payola in the music industry, back in the day, this was a practice where labels and managers were, it was very corrupt. Everybody was paying all the DJs behind the scenes to get their artists on the radio. And anyways, it ended up becoming illegal. There was this huge payola scandal in the US, and it's now not legal to have payola anymore. But I can promise you, we still have payola. It just comes in different forms. They found ways to get around it. It still very much controls the music industry and which artists you end up hearing. And I think that the same would be true of politics. Until you remove the control, there's going to be an incentive, and really putting these stopgaps in place would only create a black market, and a kind of black market that truly powerful people can get around and not ever be held accountable for. And so you've got to actually remove the government's authority over the economy and really reduce the size of government if you ever hope to actually get a hold of cronyism.
Yeah, totally agree. So I'm one of the rare kids that never was a socialist. I went straight from high school to work. And when you go straight from high school to work and you see, and especially if you're working in high school and then go straight to work, you see how much the government takes out of your paycheck immediately, and you see what the return you're getting out of it is. And you become instantly skeptical of the government's capability to help you. I wonder if that's one of the reasons why so many younger people are susceptible to socialism, because so few of them seem to go directly to work. It seems like everybody goes to college because they can get loans that they really shouldn't be eligible for. And that's a whole different conversation about why they're eligible for them. But do you think that's part of the issue, that no one lives in the real world until they're 30 now almost? It used to be when you were 18, you were self-sufficient and you had to figure things out, but now it's much later in life. So there's a bigger drive for people to want more government handouts because they haven't lived on their own 2 feet yet. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I started working under the table when I was 10, and I've always loved working. I cleaned my neighbor's house for a while, and then I started working for a store where I was paid in Beanie Babies, which was a very lucrative position for me for some time. And I just love to work. I've always loved to work. I was brought up to enjoy it. I think that's one place I've never really understood a lot of people in the socialist mindset. Like, they really hate work, and they'll say this quite openly. Like, I just hate work. I love work. I even love like manual labor. Like, I love to like dig a ditch or like pull up hardwood floor and replace. I just love it. And I don't understand people who don't. Like, what do you do with your time? I work all the time. I have multiple contracts and I love it. So I think that's one place of disconnect where people are just, it used to be that we worked. Kids worked. They participated in the farms at their homes, or they participated in the chores around the house. And I guess a lot of people maybe don't have that from a young age these days. But I had that. And then, I worked all through high school. I bought my first car. I worked through college, and I really, really liked it. And I found so much value in it. I think that's one thing we've done a really bad job of amplifying is like the value of human work and like the dignity in all work. And instead we've got this culture that looks down on certain kinds of work, or like doesn't see, how much work contributes to your mental health, to your place in life, to your, identity. It's such a good thing for people to work. And so I do think that perhaps because they start working so much later, they're stunted in that. I also think you're right that many of them are given loans they shouldn't be. They end up in debt because they make bad choices. They get stupid degrees. They then can't get paid for those degrees, and there's a lot of debt. And then they blame the economy for that situation instead of blaming government that put them in that situation by offering them these crazy loans for these ridiculous degrees they should have never gotten. And so I think when they start to feel like the deck is stacked against them, and I kind of get that mentality, if you're told all your life, go to college, jump through these hoops and you'll get a good job, and then you don't, and you feel like you're trying to work hard and yet you can't get ahead, you can't get out of debt. Like, I understand why you might start to feel like the system was rigged or you'd want a different way of doing things. But again, that goes back to people just simply not understanding the root cause of the problems that got them in the situation in the first place.
Yeah, I think we got enough time to dive into that a little bit. As I said, I've never been a socialist, but I wasn't really a libertarian on economics until a couple of years ago. And it was when I actually started digging into what you're talking about how the government enables reckless spending on a personal level, not just on their own level, but for everybody, whether it's their houses or their cars or their college degrees. People have imaginary money that they shouldn't be granted because they really don't have any way of paying it back. But because of our monetary system, our artificially low interest rates, the way the Federal Reserve works, it's just a debt fueling machine that gets everybody buried in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. It gets them to a place where they don't own any of their own possessions. They're just payment to payment their entire lives. And, a lot of people would blame that on capitalism, where if you actually had a true capitalist system, it would encourage saving and investment, not just spending everything you have. But because of this crony consumerist society we live in, you're not encouraged or rewarded for saving anything because the currency is being devalued. If you can get more payments going, you can sometimes qualify for different tax breaks. I mean, everything about the system encourages you to be reckless instead of responsible. And that's why everybody's reckless. It all goes back to the government. And I of course saw that in life, like how reckless everybody was, but I didn't understand the root cause until I started studying economics and listening to Peter Schiff and, some people that really peel back the onion and get into why everything is the way it is. But yeah, if people actually studied this stuff, they'd be shocked.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. And I also think, I want to couple those points with another, which is that there's a real eradication of personal responsibility in our society, right? Like there's a lot of people who don't want to grow up and face the repercussions of their own choices. And yes, we are in very much a consumer society, but you have every ability to decide if and when you participate in that, how you go about it. You have, you should be able to exercise self-control. And I think there's some good examples of that. I know people that make far less than me that are getting approved to buy $500,000 houses. That would be stupid. You don't need to buy a $500,000 house. Like, take that approval and go find the cheapest house you can if it's your first time around. Like, work to build equity. There are ways that you can choose to exercise self-restraint, even given the problems our government creates in our system. And what I instead see is a lot of people not exercising that self-restraint or making personal good choices and then wanting to blame other people for their system. And I think that socialism is a very convenient system for people like that, because it teaches people that they're victims and then nothing that happens to them is their fault, and that, you know, as a whole, they would all be very well off and prosperous were it not for these greedy other people in society. Whereas I think capitalism and liberty at large says, you know, there's risk involved in this. You might do well, you might not do well. It really comes down to, you know, if you work hard, if you're smart, if you exercise self-control, and then also somewhat to luck. You know, sometimes people do the right things and still fall in hard times, but it's the freedom of pursuing the opportunities that you think will better your lives. It's worth the risk of it. But I do think our system is one that asks people to really pick up the personal responsibility mantle and direct their own lives. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people that remain emotionally stunted, want to remain sort of in a childlike mentality, want the government or other people to come in and take care of them, instead of saying, no, I'm going to take responsibility. I'm going to set my own path. I'm going to direct my own course, and I'm going to incur the risk that might come along with that. But also I will reap the benefits and the rewards that can come along with that. So I do think government is stacking the deck in some ways. For sure, it's making loans too easy to get. It's, you know, it's messing with the actual value of our currency, and it's doing things that incentivize people to make bad choices. But in response to that, I think we have a responsibility as human beings to become more educated, to become more involved, to look out for our own interests, and to try to do what we can to increase our knowledge and not be taken advantage of. We live in the age of information. We have more information at our fingertips than people have ever had in history. You know, you can find out so many things, and I meet many people who are wonderfully self-educated and who spend their time and devote themselves to that. So I think we also we can blame government, and government deserves a lot of blame, but we also do need to blame people and individuals for making poor choices sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been 100% debt-free my entire adult life. And, you know, I do give up on some luxuries. Like I own a 1994 Toyota pickup truck that I still drive around. But, you know, I think that you're 100% correct that people can duck the system if they choose to. It's very easy to just go along with what you're encouraged to do, what you're told to do. But the buck stops with you, and you can work around the system if you're smart enough or if you're disciplined enough. It's not that hard. I mean, I've done it. But we're coming up on time here, so I'll let you go. But thank you so much for coming on. It was a great conversation. We'll probably have to do this again. But just tell people where they can follow you, where they can keep up with you, and what they can do to help you with anything.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me. I've very much enjoyed it, and I really appreciate all that you're doing, and I think the world of your show and your work. So people can find me on Twitter at HannahCox7. I have a public Facebook at Hannah Danielle Cox 7. They can find me on YouTube at Hannah Cox, and my channel is Based with Hannah Cox. That show is also available on iTunes and on Spotify. So those are some great places to connect with me, and then you'll see plenty of other links from there on. If they want to read my work, they can go to fee.org and find a lot of my articles, and I would love to connect with people further.
All right. Well, thank you, Hannah. Everyone go check her out. I've got her YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter pages in the description, and then you just heard her where you can check her out everywhere else. So thanks, Hannah. We'll do it again.
All right.